Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world. With self-care strategies from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda, neuroscience, and beyond. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and transformation catalyst, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Hello, friends. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you are exceedingly well. Today's episode is about self-trust. But before we get into the conversation portion, I want to talk about self-trust and how we get there through discernment. Discernment being the faculty of our minds that we associate with the season of autumn, the metal element, and our immune systems, specifically our lung qi. How this all relates in Chinese medicine, that your immune system needs to be a good judge of what is a threat and what's not a threat, right? We're exposed to viruses and bacteria that might do us harm if it can get through our protective qi, which the lungs plays an important role in supporting. But we also need to not overreact to benign threats like pollen. So when the immune system goes awry and starts attacking our own bodies or things that it's getting a signal is harmful, that obviously something's off there. We don't want our immune systems to be overactive. We also don't want them to underreact to the threats that are out there. And mentally, there's a parallel here, right? We want our minds to be open enough so that we can learn and grow. But we also want to be discerning enough to run things through our own filter, taking in what's useful and letting go of what's not. We want to be able to defer to others when their expertise is needed, or to get feedback from our partners or our friends, our coaches and teachers and medical providers. But also, we want to not lose ourselves in that process. This is really important because it's actually kind of striking to me how often we can find ourselves in positions of potentially being victims of manipulation or being manipulated by other people. Perhaps you've had the experience of going to a workshop or a yoga class, working with a coach, or even going to a rock concert where you're really resonating with the message. You're totally feeling the vibe and you're into it. You're like, yeah. And then at a certain point, you start to feel like what's being said or advocated is crossing a line for you internally. Like, I can go along with most of this, but this part here, that feels like too much, too far, hard no. A relatively benign example, I was recently at an outdoor vaccinated-only Michael Franti concert, and he kept encouraging us to put our hands up and to jump around, and I realized what was going on. Yeah, he's using the power of the stage and the high-energy music and the lights to manipulate people in a gentle way to having a good time. But then he started saying, now everybody give a high five to the person next to you. And so I'm high-fiving the friend that I came with. He's like, now go hug a stranger. And I'm thinking, nope, that does not feel COVID safe to me. So obviously it's like, I'm not making Michael Franti my spiritual teacher, but in that moment, I had to know where my line was in order to know, to feel like I was walking the path that was right for me. Another example, a few years ago, I was working with a business coach, and when I was trying to follow his particular advice, which did a lot of putting yourself out there and all that, and because I was dealing with a lot of anxiety and depression at the time and couldn't follow through on some of these suggestions, he essentially blamed me for being stuck in my limiting beliefs and told me that basically it was my fault for being uncoachable, rather than recognize that I was suffering from mental health issues. And looking back, it's really easy for me to spot his ignorance of the very real challenge that I was experiencing and to have compassion for myself. But at the time, that judgment, I took it on and it did damage. It was really, it was hard. When I was pretty broke in my 20s, I was part of a New Thought spiritual community where we were encouraged to practice tithing to the organization. Not 10% of our income, but as tithing literally means tenth, but 10% of what we would want our income to be. So I actually practiced this for a few months, but then I was like, wait, this does not feel right to me. Was I resisting an abundance mindset? Or was I resisting a self serving organization? I've also had the terrible experience that's horribly common to all too many of us who've gone out on dates with people who seem charming at first, but then we find ourselves feeling pressured and manipulated into doing things we don't want to do. There are, of course, all sorts of people who use positions of power to manipulate their followers or people in their charge. And it is very easy to blame ourselves for getting into these situations when we shouldn't. The blame rests squarely in the hands of the abusers. The people in the positions of power who are using it for self serving ends, they are the ones responsible. But it can still be sticky because at some point there is an element of choice involved. We're going to get into that in our conversation later today. As medical people, I know a lot of medical people listen to this show, a lot of yoga teachers and coaches, teachers and parents. We ourselves are also in positions of power and influence. And I believe it's our responsibility to really get that and to take it seriously that a lot of times we are the ones with the authority and we're the ones with the knowledge, but ultimately it's our job to connect people with their inner wisdom. Now, of course, if we're a medical provider or the parent trying to keep someone safe, we are the ones with the expertise, and it's okay to prescribe things for our patients. That is the nature of the power differential in that relationship. But any practitioner who stirs up fear in their patients in order to get them to order the expensive lab work or say yes to the surgery will not get my referrals, no matter how good they are or how much they believe in their own solution, because I believe that a person needs to run things through their own filter. It can be scary to defer to experts, but sometimes it's really important that we do. That's their job. They know more than us about things like research and epidemiology, as the COVID epidemic brings to mind. I will refrain from a long diatribe about how irresponsible I think it is for people in the natural health world to make people afraid of the COVID vaccine to sell immune boosting supplements and enrich their own pockets. For now, I will just say that it's obvious that mainstream medicine does not have all the answers, but that does not mean that it has none of the answers. I say this as someone who takes no prescription drugs and has never had a flu shot. And while there is a risk to everything, the risk of getting COVID and spreading it to someone who may die, or you yourself suffering long haul effects, far outweighs the relatively tiny risk of long term vaccine harm, which, yes, does exist, but in a very, very tiny portion of the people who get it. And with half the population on the planet vaccinated, the data is in. I digress. There's always a cost benefit analysis to be done. People always need to weigh the potential costs and benefits of any decisions for themselves. But we also need to tune into the wisdom of our bodies, our animal instincts. And this is known as the Po in Chinese medicine, the part of the soul that corresponds with the body's intelligence, that physical, instinctual sense of what's dangerous and what feels right. My guest today makes this point many times in her own words. Kelly Thiel is an accomplished voice actress, author, speaker, consultant, and spiritual seeker. She practices yoga, does Pilates, and has worked with spiritual healers around the world on her personal journey towards enlightenment. She's also a former member of an abhorrently abusive cult called NXIVM, which has been the subject of multiple documentaries on HBO, Starz, and A&E. Kelly has survived and reckoned with her trauma such that she is now in a position to help others conquer theirs. Kelly Thiel, thanks for joining me today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
So, the NXIVM cult, just to bring people into this conversation, was the subject of the HBO documentary The Vow that I watched with my husband. My husband, mind you, is not someone who would describe himself as spiritual or personal growth minded in any way, but we were watching and we'd kind of nod and think to each other like, yeah, like we could totally see ourselves getting into this. They seem to be all about nonviolence and compassion, and they seem so nice and sincere. And a few episodes later, people are entering into these master slave relationships and asking for permission to eat calories and getting physically branded with the cult leader's initials and being forced into having sex with them. Women are recruiting other women under the guise of sisterhood and empowerment. And it was really tough to watch. But I could see how someone could be attracted to this group and then find themselves in this sort of nightmare rabbit hole scenario. I'm curious if you could give us a sense of what NXIVM was ostensibly about, what attracted you to it, and what happened to you there.
Well, that's a great question, and I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible. But I've been a seeker my whole life, and I was constantly looking for the person or the organization or the book that had the answer. So I did a lot of studying, and I kind of got to a place in my life where I felt that I needed to move forward. I needed some kind of big step forward. I felt really stuck, and I was really depressed. And one day I found NXIVM through a friend, and I was so vulnerable at that moment. And I was so in need of what I thought was enlightenment that I was going to get from this organization that I just jumped in without looking very much. I did a little bit of research, and the people were amazing. When I first went to the very first meeting, it was all about me. And everyone wanted to know how they could help me. And they made all these promises about how they could help me achieve my goals. And my goals were very simple at the time. I just wanted to be a better person, and I wanted to be happy and be joyful and just be a good person.
We all want that, right? I
That
mean, that's it's absolutely a
right?
beautiful aspiration. And who wouldn't want support around that?
Exactly. And so everyone that was at NXIVM at the time that I joined all seemed to have that joyfulness about them. They all seemed to have it together, and they all were willing. Every single person was willing to help me get there. So it was really hard to say no. And these people were normal. There's still, many of them are still my friends, but we were all very normal people, all aspiring to be enlightened. So we had this mission that was, our mission was to be better people in the world, to make the whole world a better place, and to involve as many people as possible.
Got it. And all of that sounds completely beautiful and unobjectionable.
It does. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what happened then. Like you were the first visit, it was all, or the first meeting was all about you. And I imagine it went a little differently after that.
Well, when things are all about you, it's very hard to sort of look the other way because you feel special. And so that felt really good to me. So as I started taking the classes, the first 5-day seminar, it was all the same. Everyone that it was a small group of people with lots of coaches, and everyone was getting paid a lot of attention, and we were all being supported through the curriculum. So I ended up doing the 16-day curriculum, sort of graduating from the first part of it. And everyone was saying, oh my gosh, you're getting this so well, and you're just doing amazing. And I was all in at this point. I just thought this was the most amazing curriculum. And to step back just a second, the curriculum really was good. It wouldn't have attracted all of us if it weren't. And so I was into the curriculum. They asked me to become a coach, which I thought, oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's something I would love to do. And so I became a coach very quickly and became indoctrinated into the organization over time. So I didn't know that it was happening. I didn't feel the suppression in the beginning. I didn't feel any kind of punishment. It was all about being more measurable and accountable, which is something I wanted to do because in their view, that was the way to become more enlightened.
Well, that absolutely, right? We can't see our own blind spots. It's really helpful to have somebody point them out.
Exactly. And it felt really good because in the beginning, it was called feedback. So they were giving us, feedback, and we learned how to take feedback. And over time, the feedback became more aggressive, more sort of punishing. But over time, I learned how to take it. And I thought, oh, I can take anything. So that in the long run has helped me as a person. I mean, I think that one needs to know when feedback becomes more than just feedback, when it becomes controlling. And over a period of time, it did.
And where would you say that line is?
It's so difficult to know exactly where that line is, but at the time I didn't really know. But looking back, all I know now is that when you feel something in your body isn't right, it's not right. And we were learning to suppress those feelings in our body, not intentionally, but we were told that those feelings in our body are just our body's way of wanting to run away or not do the work or not be accountable. So after a period of time, I stopped listening to that part of myself. Now, whenever I have that feeling, and everyone has it, our intuition comes up, I listen. So the line really is at any point where you feel the information you're getting is not true for you.
Wow, that is a really powerful answer and a messy one, right?
Hmm.
Because I think about making change in my own life and I know what resistance feels like and I know what fear feels like and I know what seduction feels like
Hmm.
and I know what like and sometimes I don't really know, is this the voice of fear and resistance, or is this the voice of, is this actually something that I really need to do for my own growth? Like growth is uncomfortable, growth is scary. And on the when we are kind of like on the cusp of change, a lot of times the ego does fight back and we can get these very visceral senses of like, I feel like I'm dying. I feel like I'm jumping off a cliff. Is there a difference between fear of like ego death and identity evolution versus fear versus like the alarm bells of your intuition saying this is dangerous?
Yes. And I think that when our ego is getting in the way, so I think the first thing people need to do is when they have that feeling is to stop and reevaluate and ask themselves,
Yeah.
is the choice I'm getting ready to make, is that moving for my highest good or away from my highest good? Is it moving toward love or away from love? And it can still be scary if you're willing to make a move that feels fearful and you think you're moving towards something that is good for you. Sometimes we need to start making that move toward that and then reevaluate as we go. So instead of just like jumping off into the river, you take slow steps into the river and you reevaluate constantly.
And yeah, a lot of times like getting involved with an organization, I can see how that actually makes like perfect sense. It's not a one and done. You continue to evaluate where you are in real time, right? As things evolve. And there's other decisions like quitting a job where that might not necessarily be an option. but but I suppose we're in choice there. And that's sort of the difference, is that no one's telling you to do that necessarily.
And yeah, and sometimes we do make choices that are not the best choices, but we don't have to stick to them. There's always
Exactly.
effects to those choices, but you can always change route at any point you want. And
Right.
so see, for me, when I got into NXIVM, I was so gung ho and I was so desperate to become enlightened that I was willing to listen to anyone who had the answer instead of checking myself and asking myself, is this really a good choice for me? Is this really the truth for
Mm-hmm.
me? Instead of listening to myself.
So it sounds like desperation is not a great place to make decisions from.
Absolutely not. And that's why I always tell people, sleep on it. Just sleep on it. Think
Mm-hmm.
about it. Run it through
Mm-hmm.
your filter. Your filter will tell you what is right for you and what isn't.
That is something I am constantly encouraging my patients and coaching clients to do, is that like, here's my take, but run this through your own filter
Mhm.
and see what happens, because I'm not God. I don't know what's right for someone else necessarily. But I may have ideas, but ultimately if it doesn't really resonate, it's not going to be good for them. And yet it can be tricky when someone doesn't necessarily trust their own filter, especially people who've been taught to not trust themselves or told that they are in some way inherently flawed or bad. And so, like, I imagine that would make someone fairly vulnerable to being manipulated.
Yes, and I think the second guessing of the self will cause a lot of problems. And that's why I always go back to the importance of sitting with yourself and getting
Yes.
to know what you feel like quietly, sitting with yourself, because that's where your knowingness is. And we always doubt ourselves. I doubt myself all day long, but I always go back to that quiet place and I ask myself, and we do know the difference. We do know the difference. And so it's like the sitting with that feeling of like, okay, this may be uncomfortable, but this really is the truth for me. Or this might not be so uncomfortable, but this is not the truth for me. Do you know what I'm saying? There's like this place of knowing yourself. Like I want the candy, but I know that it's not good for me.
Yeah, yeah. To me, those have different voices, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
they actually speak from sometimes different places in my body when I tune in.
And you have to get to know your body. So you have to get
Yeah,
to know those voices and get to know yourself in a quiet place.
yeah. This seems like a really good, compelling argument for a mindfulness practice that's centered in the body.
Absolutely. And a mindfulness practice can be taking a walk without music, without anything, just walking in nature. It can be sitting
Mm-hmm.
quietly in your room. It can be a lot of different things, but you must know yourself. You must know that all your answers come from inside. They don't come from the outside. Trust me. I was seeking on the outside and I got into a lot of trouble. So they're all on the inside, all your answers.
I couldn't agree more. That's huge. And sometimes it's not time to know, right? Sometimes that wisdom isn't available in that moment because we're not clear yet. And so
Correct.
doing things that either having the patience, like it says in the Tao Te Ching, right? Do you have the patience to wait until the mud settles and the water is clear? Can you wait for right action to arise by itself?
Yes, and I think that the universe, God, however you want to see this, will give you the answer. It's there. It will show up for you, but you need to be patient.
A Healthy Curiosity turned 5 years old in July 2021, and I want to express some heartfelt gratitude for you, for listening, for sharing the show, for your ratings and reviews, and for being a fellow giver who cares about your health and personal evolution. This show would not exist without you. To celebrate, I've put out a virtual tip jar. If this show has inspired you, encouraged you, or taught you something over the past 5 years, you're invited to leave me a tip. Head to the show notes and click on the link to the tip jar, or head to brodywelch.com/product/tip jar, all one word. Your gratitude made visible will totally make my day. Now back to the show. I'm wondering, since you didn't set out to intentionally join a cult, right, as no one does, and yet there was this progression from like the feedback getting more aggressive, that what helped you realize that you had ventured into dangerous territory?
I was being recruited into DOS, which was the part of the organization I did not know about at the time that was branding women, and they were becoming slaves to other slaves who were slaves to Keith Raniere. So I was being recruited into that organization over dinner one night, and the person asked me for collateral. And that word to me just really stuck to me in a way I can't even tell you. My whole body went off. But yet, that was the inside of my body was saying, danger, danger, Will Robinson,
Mm-hmm.
alert. But my mind was saying, this is something I want to do. I want to become more measurable and accountable. So the indoctrinated part of me was moving forward with this, but my body was going off. And so I took a little break from that moment because I was thinking to myself, this could include my family. This could hurt my friends, my family, my husband. This is putting me in a very precarious place because the collateral it could be a house deed, it could be a bank account. So it wasn't just me anymore. And so I took a little bit of a step back from that just for a moment because my body was going off so badly. And then someone sent me a link to the Frank report, and maybe 2 or 3 days later, describing this organization, which had never been described before in public because it was a secret organization. And there was the word collateral in there. And that's when I knew, okay, this is real and this is wrong. Something is really bad here. And from that point on, I had to do a lot of investigating because no one was telling the truth. It was all lies and secrets, and no one had the full picture. But I think sometimes our bodies will show us a word, or that we'll hear something or see something or feel something that is a huge red flag that will go off for us to tell us something's not right. So that was the beginning of the line for me. It didn't just happen overnight. You don't become unindoctrinated overnight. It's a process.
So it sounds like your gut brain axis was in full effect, your enteric nervous system, that part of
It
ourselves
was.
that it is that bodily wisdom that tells us when we're in danger and when
Mm-hmm.
to run for the hills, or or fight or freeze.
Mm-hmm.
That was really your alarm bell, and thankfully you were paying attention to it. That's
Well, it's funny because like the body was going off, but my mind wasn't paying attention to it. So I almost had two things happening at the same time. So when I talk about that instant, I always tell people that the body always knows. The brain doesn't always know. The body always knows. And so let your body inform you if you're not sure what's going on. Let your body inform you. It's primitive. It goes back thousands and thousands of years in terms of how much we've developed it, and it always knows.
It always knows. And furthermore, as we've learned from the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that the
Mm-hmm.
body not only knows, but its job is to shield the mind from what it knows sometimes, right? That's how that is part of how we process past
Mm-hmm.
trauma, and that there can be a walling off of sorts, right? Like that,
Yes.
or a disconnect, and that the more integrated we are, the more information we have.
Yes, our fight or flight will override our brain, and it just moves. We just move forward. If you're in fight or flight mode, it just shuts everything else down, but the access to the body to get to run or do whatever it needs to defend. So that's kind of what happened to me in that moment.
And when you say it like so your body was going off in a really unignorable way,
Mm-hmm.
but your mind was really attached to, you wanted to be enlightened, you wanted this measurable and accountable system, that and from this group of people that were very interested in you, and very like meeting some of your needs that perhaps weren't getting met
Yes.
elsewhere. I'm curious about what what were your internal vulnerabilities, like that made your mind feel like it was so desperate for this particular solution?
Well, I have always struggled with perfection. So enlightenment to me was perfection. And so my vulnerabilities were the fact that I was always working on that I constantly needed attention and approval, which goes with being a perfectionist. And so those were my vulnerabilities that they saw right off the bat.
Wow, there are a lot of perfectionists listening. I know there's at least one in the form of me, recovering perfectionist, but I
Yes.
know a lot of people listening. This is an issue, and especially, I think, especially for women, a lot of times, right? There's this desire that if I can only look perfect, have the perfect body, have the perfect soul, have the perfect, shave this
Mhm.
edge off of my personality, then I will be okay. Then I will be acceptable. Then I'll be worthy of love. Then I'll be able to rest. Like all of this sort of idea that these conditions that we put on self-acceptance, that it's something that we have, that is out there and in the future, as opposed to something that we can just give ourselves in any moment.
Exactly. And when your when somebody who wants to manipulate can see those vulnerabilities, it's very easy to manipulate a perfectionist because they're always doubting themselves. They're never good enough. They don't know that. And I came to know after getting out of NXIVM and doing a lot of work on myself on the inside that being, for me, enlightenment was no longer this thing to attain. I realized that I already had it inside of me in a perfectly imperfect body, right? So our bodies are not perfect. Our minds are not perfect. We're not perfect people. We make mistakes all the time. But I realized that I could find myself on the path that I was on, wherever I was in the moment right now, as perfectly imperfect and okay. So being okay with being perfectly imperfect right now in this moment where I am. That to me is enlightenment.
Yeah, I love that definition. I love that definition, because you're not talking about knowing all of the answers of and secrets of the universe. You're talking about a deep level of self-comfort.
Acceptance, accepting yourself where you are right now as perfectly imperfect. And that doesn't mean that I'm not working toward goals or trying to be a better person every day. I'm always working on that. But wherever I am today, however many times I fail, and I will fail many times today, I'm okay with that. I'm okay where I am. I
Mm,
fail, I get
yeah.
back up, and I start to keep working toward my goals. But I don't beat myself up and punish myself. I just say, I'm okay right where I am. That's enough.
That is huge. This foundation of acceptance if I'm hearing you, it sounds like what you're saying is that you have this fundamental, unchanging self acceptance that leads to like a bedrock self love, even as you recognize that you don't have it all figured out and that you're going to make mistakes and you're going to screw up, and that's okay because you're going to continue to learn and evolve.
Exactly. And there, we talk about self-love and it just people ask me, so you've managed to figure out self-love? No. I just remind myself every day that I'm trying to love
Mm-hmm.
myself and I'm okay that I'm imperfect. So it's a constant reminder to myself that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fail, even in the little things or big things. It's okay. I'm perfectly imperfect the way I am, and it's a constant reminder. And I'm always working toward that every day.
And sometimes it just feels like that's completely not true. Like I can think about, I mean, just the other day I was making a house call for a friend who was dying, and she was uncomfortable, and she told me to move her, and I knew that I should have asked somebody else to help me, but I went ahead and moved her. I was responding to the urgency in her voice and wanting to alleviate her suffering, and I lifted her hips and dropped her back down onto the bed, and my wrist did this like terrible popping, and I knew I had hurt myself, and I was so pissed at myself. I was just like, I just overrode my inner wisdom and I'm paying for it. And I just could not stop beating myself up over that because I had overridden my
Mhm.
internal wisdom. That to me is such a sticky thing. It's like because you know better, but you
Right.
didn't do it. You didn't listen. And so and this is like a tiny, tiny example. I'd love to hear from you how you were able to regain self-trust and forgive yourself for something that was a pretty big deal, right? Getting involved with like overriding your inner voice, your inner wisdom, and getting back to a point where like you could stop berating yourself for it.
Well, first of all, I'm really sorry about your friend.
Thank you.
It's,
She actually passed today,
oh,
and it was, I think, a blessing that she went so quickly. And she was one of the most beautiful souls I've ever had the privilege of knowing. I'm
mm,
glad she's on to the next world.
yes. So, reestablishing self trust and forgiveness is a huge deal. And in the beginning, when I left NXIVM, it took a long time. I was beating myself up. I was embarrassed. I didn't want to be around people. I didn't want to be asked the questions of, were you really in a cult and what happened? And I really wasn't ready for all the judgment that went with
Mm,
that and the
yeah.
criticism, because that's what I was trying to get away from in NXIVM. Being a perfectionist, I thought if I could attain enlightenment, then I could get away from all the criticism and judgment. So here I found myself right back where I started, only further back, actually, in a much deeper hole. And so I realized I had two choices. I could stay in my house and hide for the rest of my life, or I could find a way to climb out of the hole. And the way that I did that was I had counseling and I did a lot of self work on myself. I'm a Reiki master teacher. So I did a lot of Reiki to sort of keep the energy moving through my body and some tapping. But what I really did that helped me get over the hump was I started journaling and I started owning my story. I started owning the responsibility that I had in my own choices. I started documenting that. I started looking at how I was blaming myself and the judgment. And then writing my story in a way through journals every day that I could see myself for the first time as an imperfect human being who made some choices that were, her intent was to become enlightened, but the effects of what happened and some of the bad choices I made along the way got me indoctrinated into this cult. So it was really about seeing my story, looking back through my journals, seeing myself and saying, oh my gosh, this woman got herself in trouble. This is what happened to her. And then owning it. Then I took the next step and said, this is me. And I owned my story. And I think when you can own your story, good, bad, ugly, most of us don't have these beautiful stories. They usually have a lot of different things they're not happy about. There's blame and shame and everything in there. But if you can own it and say, this is me, that for me helped me to move through and forgive myself without shame or blame.
That's I love that. I love that for you. And I can't imagine that that was an easy process, right? That anytime we have to take ourselves back through something painful, it's like, who wants to do that? who wants to
Right.
who wants to relive the yuck? And yet I've done similar exercises where yeah, it can, I think, unlock a certain amount of self-compassion, like seeing yourself as a character in a story
Mhm.
who is maybe a little distant from your present day self, but to be able to have compassion for that person and to see the journey, to see how things transpired, and maybe even to be able to decide what it means for you now.
Yeah, I think that being able to see yourself as a full human being who makes mistakes a lot, just like everyone else makes mistakes, to be able to
Exactly.
see yourself and say, yes, this happened and I'm okay with it because I'm human. That helped me to move forward and keep moving forward so that every day I get a little bit stronger in the judgment that still happens. And sometimes I look back and think, what was I doing? But then I look back at my experience and say, okay, this was part of my whole entire journey in life. This isn't my whole journey, it's part of my journey. So if I add the NXIVM experience into my whole journey of experience, I'm able to pull from the NXIVM experience things that I can move forward with. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. And something that you went through, it doesn't define the totality of who you are as a human being. And it in fact equips you to be doing the work that you're doing now, correct?
Correct. And I think that there is no specific experience in anyone's life that defines them unless they choose to allow it to define them. Otherwise, they can take anything, pieces from that experience to build upon, whether it be that they were extraordinarily courageous in that moment, or there are positive things that happen in just about every experience. And what can you take from that to put into your toolbox to move forward?
I think I appreciate that framing there at the end. What can you take from it to put in your toolbox to move forward? Because I can think about, there's lots of different ways to write the same story, right? Like that, just like the parable about the elephant, and the people, the one that's touching the trunk says it's a snake,
Mm-hmm.
and the one that's touching the ears says it's this like, flat thing, and nobody has the full picture. And so I can imagine that if we were to all write our own autobiography through a lens of low self-esteem or high self-judgment or all sorts of things, that we could write a pretty terrible story. And there wouldn't necessarily be a lot to mine from that would feel very empowering. So it seems like going into that exercise with a question or with an intention of how this could actually, like, where are the places that can serve as building blocks of strength or something to take with us in the future that helps us digest that life experience in a way that's nourishing as opposed to toxic.
Yes, and I think another really important point is to see yourself as imperfect so that you can say, okay, I am not perfect, so I can move forward as a human being who's not perfect. And it's okay because I'm moving through just like everyone else. To see yourself that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's recognizing your common humanity, like in the words of Kristen Neff's self-compassion work, right? That idea that we
Hmm.
make mistakes just like everyone else on the planet, and that really, that trying to be perfect, we're trying to be, like, no one is perfect, and therefore identifying with perfect is to deny our fallible
Humanity.
humanness. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And to also, like, we can look at any situation through the lens of being a victim, or we can look at it through being a survivor. And I'm not saying there aren't victims, because there are situations where people are completely victims. But in a situation like mine, I was able to pull out the part. I decided I didn't want to be a victim. And so I chose to pull the parts from my story for myself that showed me making good choices, the parts that were good and moving forward, and forgiving the parts that weren't good. So it's about looking through at the lens as almost like a third party, like looking at, oh, look at her. Look at how she's struggling here. Look at how, oh, she made a bad choice there. And it's that way you can have compassion for that person. And then eventually the big compassion is for you.
And is that compassion for this third party, or this slightly distant past self that you're writing about? Is that compassion one of the keys to forgiveness?
I think yes. And I think forgiveness isn't really about forgetting the situation or condoning anything that happened. It's really about letting go of resentment for yourself so that you can move forward. It's about letting go of the anger and resentment, not the situation and not condoning it, letting go of the resentment so that you can, that's a self-love act. It's for you.
And I hear that advice all the time, and I help clients with it. I give that advice all the time, right? That idea of like, what if there's nothing to forgive here? Or what would it look like to drop that resentment? Do you have any concrete tips as to how to let go of resentment?
It's a choice. So there's things in my life where I still feel like I'm holding a bit of a grudge or resentment toward things or people. And I work on it all the time. And letting go of resentment is about, okay, this thing happened, can't do anything about it anymore. It's over. Let's make some space and move the resentment out and open up a space for something else. So it's a choice that, for me, it's a choice that I make, and it's an ongoing choice. And eventually,
just going to say sorry to interrupt, the ongoing choice, that is very important. Some things that I thought that I'm over, they will crop up and I'm like, oh, I guess I'm still holding on to resentment about that.
Yep,
here it is again.
But eventually, over time, I have found that they don't crop up as many times.
Yeah,
they don't crop up as much. And then eventually one day you wake up and you just don't feel it anymore. It's almost like it doesn't matter anymore.
And do you find that actually sort of lets the story evolve a bit? Like that if we're the meaning makers of our lives, that as we believe this new empowering story to a greater degree, the stuff that was super painful diminishes in its power.
Exactly, because I think we have two choices in life. We decide what we're going to give meaning to. Like if something happens, I decide what it means for me. And then I decide what kind of meaning I'm going to give it going forward. So those are the two choices that I have in the world. So when something happens, I give it meaning.
I'd love to hear a bit about your book that you have coming out. And I know that it's about gloriousness. And so tell me a little bit about what you attempted to do with the book.
Well, originally I hired two different ghostwriters to sort of write my experience in NXIVM, and it just didn't work. So I ended up doing it myself. And basically there's stories of my life. Many of them include my experience in NXIVM, where I take a look at what was happening in my life and how I was able to sort of come to a turning point, basically. So I cover things like guilt and forgiveness and reconciliation, themes like that. And I look at how, at the end of the day, like we talked about before, gloriousness is already inside of us. Enlightenment is already within us. And we need to remember that. We have to remember where it is. We have to remind ourselves it's inside of us, not outside of us.
Are there any particular practices that you could offer people listening about how to stay connected to their inner wholeness and inner wisdom?
There's many things that I do on a daily basis. One of them is Qigong. That's one practice that I do just like 5 minutes a day, just to help to get the energy flowing.
Also known as Qigong, right?
Qigong. I'm sorry. I always say Qigong. I'm sorry. Qigong.
No problem. I think actually Qi is the Japanese word. So I wasn't meaning to correct you or be snarky. It's
no worries. Yeah.
But listeners of this show know that I teach Qigong. So
oh, you teach Qigong. Oh my gosh. Well, I just recently started doing Qigong, and I'm finding that it is amazing for keeping the energy flowing, because I think that when you have your energy moving without blocks, just like with Reiki and other forms of energy work, when you have that energy flowing, you have much better ability to be in the world and be connected to everything that's going on. Since we're all connected, all of our energy, and we're constantly reading each other and reading our environment, I think it's very important to do some kind of energy work every day. I think meditation is great. It's another good form of going inside. But I think the really important probably exercise to do on a daily basis is just sitting quietly with yourself and feeling your body. You'd be amazed of all the things that are going on inside your body and understanding what it feels like to feel okay or not okay. Because sometimes I sit quietly and I don't feel okay. And I just acknowledge that and I feel it and just try to bring myself to a balanced, grounded place. And I think that is the most important thing for intuition so that you can start making better choices listening to yourself.
For the record, I did not tell you to answer that way, but that is something that I absolutely could not agree with more. I think everyone does need some kind of a body-mind practice that helps us stay connected to ourselves, that we get in touch with every day so that we can build that relationship. Kelly, if people are interested in learning more about your work or potentially getting your book and reading it, where would you have them go?
So my book will be available on Amazon sometime end of October. My Instagram is the Kelly Thiel, Thiel. My website is kellyteal.com. And I am also featured in the Stars, Seduced on Stars, which is another 4-part series on the NXIVM story.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience and your wisdom, hard one that it is, with all of us today. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening today. To check out the show notes, get on my email list, or drop me a line, head to brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something new or feel inspired to try something different in your life, I'd love for you to pay it forward by sharing this episode with a friend who you think could also benefit and give them a reason to listen. You'll be helping to create a world where we encourage each other to embody self-respect. Till next time, be good to yourself.